Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started here. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Van Weergen, and I'm the Marketing Director here at the International Institute for Analytics, also known as IIA. We are so excited for our annual Predictions and Priorities webinar today. This is one of our biggest ones of the year, and as you can see, the four gentlemen on the phone with me today have definitely spent some time doing research, seeing what's trending, and have got some great things for you. In case you're new to IIA, we're an analytics advisory firm co-founded by Tom Davenport and our CEO, Jack Phillips. We work with companies to grow their analytics capabilities, improve performance, and get the most impact from data teams. This webinar is part of our ongoing series. It's our last one for 2019. We've got a really great program for you in 2020. But we talk about important concepts, techniques, and strategies in the world of data and business analytics. Our clients rely on IIA to provide unbiased insights and a range of perspectives from a network of independent analytics experts, researchers, and practitioners. So for more information about IIA, visit us at iianalytics.com. Before we get started, and before I introduce you to all who's going to be on the phone with us today, let's go over a little bit of housekeeping. First off, yes, a recording of this webinar will be sent out tomorrow. So you will get that. We do not send the slides, but you do have all of the audio and the visual of the slides as they click through it. We are going to be taking questions throughout. Bob Morison will be taking your questions in the chat window today. So you'll have seen a chat from me already come out, and you'll see some chats from Bob today. So make sure if you've got a question, send it on through. He'll be watching those to answer them as we can throughout the presentation. So we're delighted to welcome four very insightful and well-versed thought leaders here today. We've got Bill Franks, the CAO of IIA, Drew Smith, our Executive Director, Tom Davenport, our co-founder, and Bob Morison, our lead researcher. So Bill, a little bit about him. His focus has always been to translate complex analytics into terms that business users can understand and works with organizations to implement their analytics effectively. Tom is a professor of information technology and management at Babson College, and he wrote the famous Harvard Business Review article in 2006, Competing on Analytics, which is also his book that was published in 2007. Drew's got 20 years of experience in the business side of analytics, leveraging insights for business performance, and on the delivery side of analytics, driving the use of enterprise analytics. And Bob serves as IIA's lead faculty member. He's an accomplished business researcher, writer, and discussion leader, and has been doing breakthrough research for the last 25 years. Thank you, gentlemen, for all being here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Bill, I'm going to pass it on to you.
All right, thanks, Lindsay, and welcome, everybody. And thanks to joining today. What we're going to do is walk you through our predictions and priorities for this year, obviously. And as a precursor to that, Lindsay, if you go to the next one, let's just take a quick review of last year's predictions and priorities. So these were our predictions last year as we talked amongst ourselves about if they were mostly on target or not. We felt that for the most part they were on target. And in fact, as we go through this year's, you'll see that several of this year's predictions and priorities are actually a follow-on or the next level of some of the predictions and priorities that we made last year. So definitely still a lot happening in the analytics data science space as we'll see today. So let's hop into our first one, Lindsay. Then the first prediction, it's about the specialization of roles within the analytic workflow and how that's going to continue to accelerate. And what we mean by this is that as folks on the phone are keenly aware, the volume of data, the complexity of the models that we're building, the volume of models and analytics we're on the hook for is so much more than it used to be, that it's no longer possible to have single individuals that are able to handle an entire analytic workflow from data acquisition, preparation, modeling, deployment in large-scale enterprises. And so there's specialization happening in two distinct ways. Across the workflow, meaning people like data engineers being chartered to handle the data ingest, data scientists doing the modeling, application interface developers helping with the deployment, but also within those roles. So within data science, for example, there is now people who specialize in machine learning, people who specialize in language processing, et cetera. So both within these roles, within these phases and across these phases, we're seeing a whole lot of specialization, and we see that continuing and accelerating next year. So if we hit the next one, Lindsay, what do you do to address this specific prediction? We think the priority you ought to have is to modernize the role definitions and hiring practice in your organization. If you still have a single standard data science level 1 and level 2 job description, you're probably not where you need to be. You're going to be needing to update those to have specific types of data scientists that you need to hire, specific types of data engineer that you need to hire. And you can anticipate that all of these roles will start to continue to divide. So for example, within data engineering, we're going to start, and probably already are, seeing data engineers that focus on streaming data pipelines versus data engineers who focus on creating data sets for analytics based on a data lake of traditional corporate data. And all of this is going to continue as we go into next year. And so I guess I'll toss it over to start out with Tom. Let's start with you on this one. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think this has been going on for a while, but companies are really now starting to bite the bullet and say we really have to have some clear job definitions. That is not something you can do within the analytics or AI function alone. You probably have to start working with the HR organization. There's probably going to be some bureaucratic hassles involved in doing so, but I think it's absolutely necessary. I mean, some of these jobs, like data scientists, which or at least my editor once defined as the sexiest job of the 21st century, it's become the most meaningless job title of the 21st century because it includes virtually everything. So I was talking to the head of data and analytics for TD Bank in Toronto the other day, and he was telling me that, just as an example, I think a pretty good example, I'll try to write something about this. So they have 7 job families in data and analytics and 65 different defined jobs. And that, I think, is the kind of level of granularity that you need, not, as you suggest, Bill, analyst 1, analyst 2, et cetera. It's way more complex than that.
Drew, any thoughts?
Sorry, Frank. Sorry, Bill. Tom, I would build on that. I 100% agree. I think it's also interesting looking at the 2019 prediction that deployment and scaling would continue to be a problem. I think when you look at the roles and you talk about the specialization, for example, of data engineering, I think that's actually a critical role that was overlooked when it came to scaling analytics. And then when we talk about other concepts like embedding analytics is a really high buzzword, right? And I think when you talk about involving people like analytics translators, it will ensure that not only is the analytics done and can it scale, but will the business actually take the adaptive measures to seize on the learning and the insights? I think that it's a natural progression as we move away from an over-reliance on POCs or experiments to prove analytics value to actually moving that analytics value further out through the organization. And I'm always reminded of something somebody smarter than me said, I can't remember who it is, but many people have said it, which is that, analytics is a team sport. And you need the diversity of positions that you have, not only to make good analytics, but we'll cover ethics later. I think diversity of team sport covers the ethics component some. So I think it's really interesting to look at these roles, not only as they become more specialized and individually contribute, but actually how they contribute as a team where the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So I'm actually excited for this prediction to come true because I think as a field we'll be better when it does.
All right. Bob, any questions you'd like us to address before we...
I'm scanning the airways, but to start, I've got one. With all the specialization, what are the implications for the team leaders? Or does better role clarity allow for more self-organization by teams?
Well, this is Tom. I would say that, leadership, like all these other traits that we've been talking about is not evenly distributed. Some people are really good at being managers and leaders, and some people aren't. And so instead of just assuming that if somebody's a really good data scientist, they would, well, you know, we should promote them to being leader of the analytics and AI function, that's probably a really bad idea. We should focus on kind of leadership and managerial strengths as a separate dimension, and put somebody in the job who's interested in those kinds of activities and really good at them.
Here's a fun question. Is anyone using analytics to identify the skill adjacencies and skills needed?
A cluster analysis, maybe.
Right.
I think we're not eating our own dog food in that regard, and drinking our own champagne, whatever the case may be.
Very good.
Yeah, the only thing I would say, I think we have decent amount of data points at the IAA, especially through analytics maturity assessment, which shows that those firms that have higher degrees of specialization do tend to have higher maturity scores. So in that sense, maybe we're eating our own dog biscuits. Maybe it's not the whole meal, but there are snacks we're taking on that one to build on Tom's very colorful analogy. And it's only in the morning in Pacific Northwest, so interesting analogy for a morning.
Very good. Actually, you just, I think, answered another question that came in, which was about the relationship between analytic maturity and role specialization. They kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, and a couple of the panel. Sorry, Bill, please.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I think, Bob, the reason for that, it actually makes a lot of sense, which is if you're going to be based on our Delta model, if you're going to be highly mature, it means that you have very sophisticated analytics that are quite pervasive across an enterprise. So that means you're doing a heck of a lot of it. That means you're going to need a pretty big team to do it. And in order to achieve that scale, you're going to have touched a whole lot of different data types, algorithm types, platform types, thereby requiring you to have people with a diverse set of skills. So I think it's one of those things where whether someone intentionally diversified their job roles as a explicit step in trying to get more mature, or whether as they matured it naturally occurs, I think one way or another it'll happen.
All right, I think we've covered the topics that have come in so far.
Okay.
One thing I would add to this, if I could, we should recognize that, of course, this is how we see it now, but I think that these roles will continue to evolve and mature. And I also can see, for example, really non-traditional roles coming in. We have a client in Steelcase who I think does brilliant stuff with people who are trained in anthropology. Because they are the leading seller of office spaces and the furniture that makes it work. So I think when you have another part of your business that you can bring in even more thought leadership into an analytics team, you add value as well. Now, they don't stick with the team 100% of the time. So there is also this core team, expanded team concept that I think some leading practitioners are using as well.
All right, well, let's move on to the second one then, if you would, Lindsay. So this next one is, it's rather unfortunate, but we don't see any way around it, which is that we're going to continue to have confusion over analytics-focused executive duties. And what do we mean by that? You know, the good news is that, you know, not too long ago, 10 to 15 years ago, many even large organizations would have been lucky to have a VP of analytics, let alone a C-level person. Now, VPs are pretty pervasive in large organizations, and it's becoming more common than not to have at least one C-level analytics executive by title. However, that includes a chief analytics officer, maybe a chief data officer, maybe a chief data and analytics officer, maybe a chief digital officer. Notice two of those even go by the term CDO. There's a lot of overlapping definition between companies in terms of which of those roles does what. Then you get into how do they relate to existing execs like a chief technology officer, information officer, or marketing officer, and it's a bit messy. So go out and look at some of these executive job postings or recruitment documents, and you'll see that there's really not yet a standardization across the industry. And, that's an unfortunate scenario, but we see that continuing this year as companies just continue to try and figure out, for now, what they need best. So if you hit the next one, Lindsay, what we think you ought to do is make sure that you've rationalized the roles and responsibilities of whatever of those analytics executives you have in place. Make sure that where their role picks up and other roles drop off is made as clear as possible. And it's really important to remember that whoever the executive is will have the best understanding of what they think their role is, because they're living it every day. You cannot assume that people, especially as you go further down the chain, really have a clear understanding. And to the extent that there is ambiguity between where, say, a chief data officer and a chief analytics officer's duties begin and end, if you're having, as the chief data or analytics officer, if you're having that ambiguity between you and your peer, you can be certain that that ambiguity is amplified as you go down the chain. So try and be as clear as possible. Try and establish, at least within the organization, where those roles are, to try and make the best of the currently ambiguous situation. So for this one, Drew, I'll kick it over to you first.
Yeah, thanks. And of course, I'm really interested after I go to hear Tom's perspective, given his exposure to so many senior executives. I think also not to paint too bleak of a picture, but there are facts and figures behind this that whatever word you use after the first big C has the largest churn in the C-suite. And I think, of course, that makes sense if the board of directors or the shareholders or the family or whoever has the control of the company is not at all clear about what the expectation is, then they're going to most probably miss that expectation. And I do like this one. I think it's a bit chaotic, and I think it's also worth noting that it's good we take this one up front, because this person, whatever their title is, will actually have some responsibilities to make sure these predictions come live in a positive way in the companies that they're responsible for. So first, I'd like also to double and repeat a bit about what you say, Bill, which is that CDO could mean both Chief Digital Officer and Chief Data Officer. I mean, that's a sign of that we're really in a bit of a mess here. And from my point of view, that's really a sign of the symptom. That's not the disease itself, right? The disease is that we're unclear about what is the additional value or different value or more value that is brought by people in the C-suite focusing on analytics. So our guidance really is that before firms worry about how they title it, don't worry about that. Worry about how will this person, by focusing on data analytics, bring value to the firm. And keep in mind that whether that value is finding new avenues for growth or market penetration or better patient outcomes or cost reduction, it's very likely that it's other members of the C-suite and their organizations who actually have to take the actions that the insights point to. So it's genuinely and truly a partnership in that way. So the clarity of the role of the analytics leader in the C-suite is not only essential, but the clarity of their peers and maybe what is taken away from their peers or what their peers need to do differently is absolutely critical. And I think, Bill, you spoke about this. The quality of that clarity and the quality of that partnership will echo down the functional lines. And then I would also add that you might want to keep in mind that if you do have someone in the C-suite, the perceptions are already there about what they're supposed to do, and you might need to clear that up. So bear in mind that someone might look at this person as the chief data scientist or the chief analytics modeler. So you need to unwind these assumptions before you layer in some stuff. And what I would finally say is, in addition to the organization making the value clear, the C-suite executive needs to find their story about how they're making that value clear. And I use that story term really literally. You can reflect on the second most recent addition to the C-suite, which would be the CMO, which took some time to clarify. And I think if we're honest on this call, and we must be, it's more likely that the CMO was a good storyteller than your average chief analytics officer. So put some effort into that. So make it clear, make it compelling for the organization, and get moving in 2020 for that clarity. So as I said, Tom, really interested, given that you speak to a lot of executives, boards, as well as people who have these CDAO, CDO, CDC, CDC, whatever. So what's your take?
Well, three quick things. One, Bill's point about the the incumbents of these offices not knowing themselves who's in charge is not a hypothetical one. Last week I was talking to a chief data officer in a quite large company, and so one of my questions was, so do you lead analytics as well? And he said, that's a good question. It's maybe evolving a bit, but I have not historically, I've had BI, but not analytics, but the head of analytics is gone, so maybe I will soon, I don't know. But you can imagine what kind of confusion that causes in the rest of the organization. Two, just to attach some quantitative precision to this issue, I work with chief analytics officers, but I also work with chief data officers. And so I've recently written a piece, I found out yesterday, I think it's going to be in Harvard Business Review eventually, called 7 Types of Chief Data Officers, because it's not just analytics executives, it's chief data officers are kind of all over the map. Some are around governance, some are around monetization, some are around analytics. And I think it makes that job, really, really tough. And the final point is that I think there is a movement, I've seen it in some surveys and some interviews as well, toward increasing prevalence of the chief data and analytics officer. So maybe that will solve the problem. More and more chief data officers say, gee, without analytics, I can't really accomplish a huge amount of, business value to the organization. Some of that governance and architecture stuff is really hard to show value. So a lot of chief data officers, I think, would benefit from having analytics in their camp. And clearly you can't do analytics without data. So there's a certain logic to the combination.
Hi, this is Bob. So the first question that popped up was along the lines of how did we get here? And it seems to me that maybe at different times, different things needed extra attention and management. For example, we want to get a lot more value out of our data. But once roles are in place, they tend to operationalize a bit and persist. So I guess my follow-on question, and this relates to Tom's talking about combining some of the roles, do we see anybody abolishing the roles or even stepping way back and saying what really needs close management going forward?
That's a good one, Bob. What I've seen in a few places, maybe abolishing of the roles might not be
that sounds harsh,
the right term. But yeah, maybe the person who was initially brought in for that role ends up getting pushed out, and someone else then comes in maybe with a slightly modified charter and set of expectations. I think the biggest challenge I've seen people in some of these roles face is they'll be given the title and they'll be given a pretty big mandate, but at times, as an outside observer of what's happening, at times I have to find myself wondering, boy, are they really being given the financial and organizational backing they need to actually implement the level of change and results that's being asked of them? Because, being told, go make this happen is one thing, but being given the resources to do it and having the others in the organization embrace and work with that person to make it happen are different steps in that process that need to happen as well.
Well, we had our recent summit up at Ford, or in Detroit near Ford, and they had a chief data and analytics officer who left, and they have not refilled that same position yet. So it's not abolishing, but it's indicative of some confusion, I think.
Yeah, I think abolish is a bit harsh, but I can also be a bit harsh. I think I would say it's my belief that the change is happening rather quickly and concurrent with other changes. So, for example, there are companies which have both a CTO, Chief Technology Officer, and a Chief Information Officer, and I can see distinction that those roles are different, that they would do different things. But if you had a CIO office and you add in someone in data and analytics and someone in technology, you better have some really straightforward discussions about what's coming out of the CIO office. Because I have trouble believing that nothing comes out of the CIO office. I think there's still lots of value for CIOs to add, but I would question whether some companies are being really rigorous enough in having those discussions. And I can see it when I work at lower levels of the organization where they're not quite sure who to talk to. And so they talk to whoever they like best or whoever says yes most often.
So that coincided with a question that came in asking what's the recipe for teaming with a CIO, presumably the CDO, the CIO, teaming with a CIO. Any quick hints, Drew?
No. I think also, let's be clear, I don't think, it's not really our mindset at the IAA to talk about, okay, go into a conference room in 4 hours, it's sorted, right? Use the work that you're doing to sort it out. Have the honest conversation, because that's actually how the best teams are doing it. And I don't think that's different across levels. As you're deploying new technologies, as you're trying to move to make big moves like cloud migration, those are times to have discussions around, okay, which executive team is in the lead here and which executive team is in the support mode. So I think it's not a one and done conversation. It's done as you move and advance the business. It's just that nowadays, of course, it's done faster. So you have to be alert. You have to go with alacrity.
Very good. So this discussion has opened up a variety of questions around organizational alignment that are maybe beyond our scope. So let's move on. We might circle back to some of these questions.
Yeah, I think we should move on, make sure we get through them, but these are some great questions, so keep them coming. Our third prediction is another that builds off of last year's, which was we were dead on about ethics becoming a huge focus. Virtually every conference or event around analytics that I've been aware of this past year had at least a talk, if not a track, around ethics. I think it's been in the news, all sorts of fronts. Social media companies getting beat up, financial institutions, a wide range of companies about the ethics of the data and analytics policies that they have. And so what we see starting maybe in as soon as 2020 is actually taking it to the next level, not just getting your own house in order with policies to help ensure you're doing ethics analytically to both reduce the risk of legal exposure and or public opinion whiplash, but actually making it something that you competing on ethics or on ethical analytics. And this is something that organizations have done in other parts of the technology space. Apple's always been one that has stressed their commitment to encrypting user data and not using data in certain ways. Similarly, an organization can come out and say, this is our stand on how we do data and analytics. It's not just internal policy, but this is our commitment to you. And we think that we'll see more companies taking that stand. So if you go to the next one, Lindsay, the priority here is to have a discussion within your organization as to whether you should try and compete on ethics now or not. And when I say or not, maybe your organization doesn't want to, but secondarily, even if you do, you've got to make sure that your policies and procedures can back up that talk, because it's even worse to go out and publicly pronounce you're going to compete on ethical analytics and then end up in your own mess. So if you're not quite ready, but you'd like to, that gives a good lighting of the fire underneath everyone to really push towards getting those policies and protocols matured to where you can go public. But this will probably be something that we're going to see more and more of, not just next year, but over the next few. So, Tom, I'll kick it to you first for this one.
Well, yeah, so far, I think the highly visible stances on analytics-oriented or AI-oriented ethics have been from vendors. Apple, Microsoft, Salesforce have all announced this. I wrote a little piece about what the AI ethicist does at Microsoft, and it's basically just kind of advocate for it in the outside world, and some focus internally as well. Their president and chief legal officer is also quite focused on it, Brad Smith. But I think what we're suggesting here is to go beyond the vendor community and have users of data and analytics really start to think about this as a differentiator. And to me, I mean, I think there are problems that can be successfully avoided if you do this well, but also the big appeal is employment. And I just come across so many students who say, I don't want to work for a company that uses analytics to screw their customers or whatever, or to purvey fake news or whatever crime you're thinking about there. And so I think if you really want to compete in the employment marketplace, an ethical orientation is going to be absolutely necessary. And then there are other ones as well related to customers and regulators and so on, but can help all around. I don't think that you need to have a full-time ethics board. I'm not even sure that every organization needs a full-time ethicist. It's interesting, I just assigned to the class I teach on AI to MBAs we had a week talking about ethics, which they really appreciated, but they kept bringing up the same few examples of algorithmic bias, the Amazon employment model and Apple credit card, charging different rates for men, or different, having different income qualifications for men and women. There aren't very many of these things out there. We keep bringing up the same ones. So that suggests to me it's not going to be a huge problem, but certainly one that companies want to be on top of.
Yeah, I think that's really great. I really actually appreciate, Tom, the insights from the students. We often talk about in analytics how hard it is to find the volume and the quality of the talent. So for sure, you don't want, as a company, to reduce your capacity to attract and retain talent, which is, of course, a big challenge. I also think I'm a little bit optimistic. I'm not quite sure that people have intentionally done unethical things. So I think from an analytics leader perspective, you need to realize that you're not going to intentionally, well, maybe you are, but you're very unlikely to intentionally do bad things ethically. But you need to look at how your system operates and look at opportunities to ensure that you do act ethically. And back to the point of individual choice, I think it's important that you make it clear to your team that they can sort of raise the flag, or in the Toyota manufacturing way, pull the red lever when they think that you're going down the wrong path. So I think it's really important to build in systematic checks, even though, as you say, Tom, it's not that we have thousands of these examples. Still, when they happen, they seem to be quite impactful. Although I don't know that it's hit Apple's market share, but that's another story. So I think it is about being aware. It is also about institutionalizing it a bit, and it's also about helping individuals in your company understand this is important to you, whether they're new hires or existing team members.
We have not had any questions come in on this, but let me ask, what's the state of the art in kind of checking your databases for inherent bias, which in turn leads to?
Yeah, people talk about algorithmic bias, but I think in most cases it's really data bias in machine learning. And now, your data is training your algorithms, so the two are closely related. But I think it's hard to see ahead of time, before you create your model, is that data source biased? I mean, you don't even know in many cases, is that particular variable or feature going to end up being influential in the model? So I think the state of the art is looking at the outcome and saying, is there gender bias or racial bias or income bias, or I don't know, some other sorts of bias that is in the people or the loans or whatever this model ends up creating. And so in a way that makes it, I think, a little harder, because you have to sort of hold back on implementation until you make sure that there's no bias. It's just adding a separate step to the process.
Yeah, and Bob, generically, I think one of the IA blogs a couple months back was about that the most important first step that you can take to ensuring that you're having ethical processes around analytics is intentionality, meaning that you have to purposely require yourself and your teams to focus on ethics from the beginning to the end. So does this data seem reasonable to use and reasonably free of bias as we enter into trying to build a model? Is that model, the way we're defining it, seeming reasonable in terms of its intent and what it's targeting? And then as we have a model score, is it okay to use this score built for purpose A for purpose B, as an example? So by forcing people to at least explicitly consider ethics as they go through the process, you'll do a better job of catching scenarios where something may have slipped through, because I agree with the point. It's very few cases where people are intentionally trying to do something unethical. It's more often the case where something evolved in a way that as analytical professionals, we can see how they got to where they were and where they went wrong, but without those explicit and intentional checkpoints along the way, sometimes you miss the oh boy, we should have thought about that. And once it's in the news, it's a little too late.
Yeah, and a bit building off of that, but again, not answering your good question, Bob, which is there some sort of computer program I can run against my database? The answer, of course, is no. But we also know that from other areas where institutional bias has set in business and society, is that when we don't have a diversity of viewpoints, which is often the case, unfortunately, in much of analytics, we can have that happen as well. So I think it's also to make sure that you're doing what you can do to bring in the diversity of viewpoints into your team. And I'm not saying that was the cause of the Apple issue. It is, in some cases, assessed to be the cause in other issues. I don't know enough details, but we know from many, many different forums that bringing in that different point of view is actually essential to anticipating the bias before it sets in.
Anything else, Bob, or should we flip to the next one?
I think we've at least brushed against responding to most of the questions.
Okay. Well, let's go on to prediction number 4. This one also builds off last year. So last year we mentioned the pressure that organizations were increasingly feeling to improve the deployment rate of their processes. And there was 2 historical issues that led to trouble with deployment success. The first, which is going to continue in the future, is let's call it the political and business process resistance. So we built some analytics that do something very impactful, but it requires changes to longstanding business practices or how people do their day-to-day job, and it can be hard to overcome that. There's no magic bullet for that. However, the good news is that the other barrier has often been some of the technological barriers. The challenge in actually moving from a development environment to a deployment environment, the issues wherein the analytics team might have different versions of software, or in some cases you have to recode into an entirely different language for deployment. There are some new technologies that have really come of age in the last year or two that are ready for prime time now. And those include things like the world of containerization technologies, serverless technologies, these technologies that enable a separation of some of the tools or coding used to develop something and the need to have that fit precisely within a given production environment, as opposed to using something like a container to enable that exact same environment to be available at runtime. So this is a huge, huge impact in terms of reducing the complexity of many deployments. And then as we see the rise of things like ML ops, machine learning operations techniques that are really focused also on streamlining the processes that even the analytics team must go through, all of these combine to make it far easier, faster, and less risky to deploy now than it was a short time ago. So, Lindsay, if you pop to our priority here, is you need to embrace these new techniques and technologies today. They're here, especially to the extent your organization is already on the cloud. All of the major cloud vendors are fully capable and ready to implement with these technologies. And as you look to partner with IT, this is a great example. You need to go and ask them, say, hey, we'd love to start using, containerization techniques in order to help us deploy more easily, and it'll benefit both of us. Are we ready to go? And if they're ready to go, then you can hop on that trend. If they're not, then you can start to develop a joint plan on when you can get there. And the good news here is that these technologies are not just used for analytics. The many kinds of other process and application development teams would also benefit from these technologies. So it's really an enterprise level enablement that is used broadly. It's not just something that an analytics organization would ask for. So I think that makes it a little bit easier to get your request raised up the priority list, because you will not be the only one asking for it. So with that, Drew, I'll kick this one to you first.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. This is another area where we do see from our assessment data that those who are more adaptive to these fast and flexible architecture are actually higher up the maturity curve. So it's also one where we can sort of support that argument. I think that it's also worth noting that, like you said, Bill, it isn't nearly as, it does reduce complexity, especially in operations, even if it can increase a feeling of complexity from a conceptual level. It's one more technology that people have to learn and adapt to, but it's a valuable technology, which is why we've put it here in the priorities. And one of the things I think that it helps get past, which is oftentimes a hurdle in larger IT organizations, is it doesn't suffer from the classic trade-off of stability versus speed. It's plenty stable, it causes no instability in the environment, but it's incredibly fast as well. Because I think we should be cautious not to be unfair to quote-unquote IT folks. Some of us have been in that world. It's not that they don't get the need for speed, it's that large-scale infrastructure often has to balance multiple priorities. And with containers, you can actually get away from that trade-off of everything being just average okay. And containers are not only fast in deployment, and that's important, they're fast actually in versioning. And as you're building algorithmic models, you realize that they're never perfect. They're never really finished. But updating them frequently can put a lot of load on an already overworked IT or technical group in your company. So that's super important. And especially when combined with containers, they really do reduce the operations headaches. So I think that's really important. And then I think they're suitable for most environments. I think they're least suitable, of course, for people that are on-prem. Most of the people that we work with are in some state of hybrid, cloud and prem, or multiple cloud. And if you're in multiple cloud providers, which quite a few are, they are really particularly advantageous. So they're always worth investigating. And I think one of the big upsides is that the toughest part of the learning curve for most people who've done work with containers is that first container. Containers basically tend to build off existing containers within an organization. They use a template, so to speak. So once you get past that first one, it's really going to be relatively straightforward after that. So I think, like Bill said, it is a matter of just getting started. So find those people in your organization who are energetic for new things, and you all have them, which is super cool. And really feel confident that with a little bit of cost and very, very, very little risk, they can go after some big upsides. And I think you'll find big opportunities in this kind of serverless technology and containers. This is oftentimes the type of thing that generates a lot of questions. I'm not sure, Bob, if we have any of those questions yet on the use of containers.
Well, we have one asking for a quick definition of containers.
Yeah, so
I've
that's
got
a
one
very
word
good
for
question.
you, Kubernetes.
Right.
Kubernetes and containers as Dockers are often confused because they work so intrinsically well together. But I mean, containers are also confused with virtual machines. They have some connection to that. I want to get the definition right off the bat. So maybe, Bill, if you have a really sharp definition.
Yeah, the way I look at it, I'm going to put this in layman's terms. So if there's anybody who's super technical in this space, that they'll probably say I've oversimplified it. But it basically it's a technology that you can spin up effectively an operating system and applications within that operating system on demand as you run it. that actually execute within whatever environment you're in. So in other words, I might be on a given server executing this container. My container can have a different version of R, for example, than the person's container next to me. And we can each use the version of R that we preferred, even though we're actually executing in the same environment. So it's a way to sort of segment off the resources such that, back to the deployment and development being easier, whatever tools I use for development now, I put those in my container and I'm good to go. And that same container gets brought up, created, and then we execute against it in the production environment. So it's a really nice way to give flexibility, and it took a lot of work in terms of the technical folks to figure out how to manage the resources properly and enable this safely. But like we say, the last couple of years, it's come along. So if you look, Docker and Kubernetes are two of the tools you'll most commonly hear about in this space, and they work very intimately together. So if you go out and search around there, you'll be able to be probably overwhelmed with the level of detail that you can find.
Yeah, Bill, and that's the key. The key concept is everything is contained in one place, right, for that microservice. And that's the key concept. You're not going back and forth across parts of the architecture.
So I have a much broader question. I know, Bill, you made the separation, but is there anything about this technological progress that, in fact, will make things easier or faster on the organizational and change management side? Or is that an entirely different kettle of fish?
It does free up. You would think it would free up attention for that. I mean, I think that's a very important point, Bob, because if you think that your only problems in deployment are technological, you are not going to be very successful at it. And so the combination of all these automated machine learning tools that can create models for you, and then tools that ease the deployment process, should free up some human attention for the stakeholder issues and process change issues and skill change issues and so on.
Good.
Any others, Bob? Or
no, I think we need to charge on to number 5, don't we?
All right, let's do it. So number 5, this is one that starting to pick up steam as well, causal models. And we think in 2020, they're going to get a little more attention. And this stems from a very basic fact that I'm sure most everybody on this call is familiar with, which is virtually every modeling methodology that we make use of finds correlations between inputs and outputs. But as we all know, correlations are not the same as causation. And so, my favorite example from Statistics 101 years back, I recall the fact that if you look at a basketball player, the points scored and the number of fouls made are incredibly correlated at an individual player level. So if you make the mistake of assuming that's causal, then you're going to have a coach saying, run out and foul as fast as you can so you can score more, which would obviously be stupid. The problem is that there's a third factor that drives both of those, which is the more minutes I play, the more opportunity I have to foul someone and the more opportunity I have to score. The actual causal factor is the minutes played. And so what causal modeling is all about is really saying there are situations, and you can think about healthcare being one obvious one, where you need to have a cause and effect. I have an ailment, you give me this treatment. That treatment, in fact, causes me to get better. In those cases where that's important, you need to go further than simply identifying here are all of the correlations between inputs and outputs that we're seeing. This really starts to combine back in some classic techniques of things like, experimental design, hypothesis testing, time series modeling, et cetera, where you're trying to get into the nature of, is A actually causing B? This will require some extra steps in many cases. You start with your traditional models. Now you have to dig in at another layer to design and execute the experiments and the analysis to determine the causal relationship existing or not. But where it makes sense, it can be a high value. So if we go to the next one, if you think about what do you do here as a priority, consider adding this into your analytics portfolio this year, and start just by simply tasking a couple of people in your organization to get familiar with the approaches that are being used in this space today. You almost certainly have people on staff who will know how to do this, in terms of they've got, statisticians obviously have spent time with things like experimental design and hypothesis testing. You've probably got the skills, almost certainly. It's a matter of directing them towards this new area. And then try and identify a spot this next year where you could do a proof of concept to really go out after a causal modeling process. And, even in a case where it's not healthcare, it's not a regulated financial industry where you have to be able to show some cause and effect, frankly, you can be pretty, gain a lot of efficiency, even in a marketing scenario, if you can have extra confidence that the lever you're about to pull on a many $million campaign is in fact going to cause what you want, as opposed to having simply been associated with it in the past. So, Tom, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on this topic, so I'll kick it to you first.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I have a lot, but I think some of this, Bill, comes out of the reaction to tools like deep learning, which have gotten people very excited in AI, but at their core are, fundamentally correlational and not causal at all, and are so complex that we don't even often have any idea how the models do what they do. So they're not causal, and we don't understand the key features or variables. So there's starting to be a lot of pushback, I think, in the AI community, that if we're really going to be successful with AI, we need to move beyond just correlational approaches toward causal ones. And there's a book by Gary Marcus and Ernest Davis called Rebooting AI that states that most clearly. You see it a little less in kind of traditional analytics because, you don't have so many models and so many variables and so on. It's a little easier to make sense of what's going on. But as we move toward more complex models, I think this will become more of an issue. I worked with a couple of Bayesian network companies on the vendor side, one in healthcare, one elsewhere, and they both are seeing a lot more interest in what they do, because you can do Bayesian networks in a causal fashion. Not all of them are, but you can employ them that way. So I think we're going to see more of this happening. Maybe the popularity of A/B testing and so on in web analytics has been another factor that's led us in this direction. So I think lots of prompts, but so far, we're taking baby steps.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for the fact that we often in the field forget that scientist is embedded in the term data scientist, right? So a couple of panelists, super smart ones as well, have pointed this out. So I think it's a rightful call out. I think what's interesting to me is also there's always going to be, by definition, leaders and laggards in this field, right? So a lot of some of the use of big data was not deployed at first in healthcare as the reference was made, but it is now, right? So these folks have sort of come with a different approach and a different goal in mind. Their goal is to help individual people remain healthy. And that requires a different approach. So I think what will be really fascinating is to see if the feedback loop continues. Maybe they will start to inspire the people that inspire them, namely retail, consumer goods, or large manufacturers, to try and make more causal models on things that are not as life and death as patient care. So I think it's a really interesting trend, and to see how it develops.
Okay, so here's a question. What we're really talking about, I think, is not just an ensemble of models, but an ensemble of methods, where we've got modeling and various experimental techniques, both qualitative and quantitative, going on. So can we say a little bit about the range of skills that might be needed, and who designs and manages the whole process here?
Yeah, I think that's a great point about it's an ensemble of methods that kind of layer on top of each other. As I think I mentioned the lead up, I think this comes down to, let's go to our basketball example. So we found this big correlation between scoring and fouling Now we want to go isolate whether A causes B. So you're going to, you're back to a classic hypothesis testing, experimental design approach. So there's people who know how to do that. There's also probably if you have especially a consumer facing website, A/B testing has been obviously ubiquitous there for many years. It's the same type of principle. You're just going to be holding a whole lot of things constant, and then seeing what effect you can find. So this is one of these things as was mentioned in the lead into this. It doesn't really entail things that are much more complicated than what you're already doing. It's just going to some extra diligence on top of where you typically would have stopped to get a result that you're able to put more confidence behind because you've established the causality versus the correlation. And so, there's a lot of places where that might be legally or ethically required, but I think even in situations like marketing for big decisions, why not have that extra confidence for those highest value problems?
Yeah, and Bill, I would agree. I think what it is essentially sort of what you point to, Bob, which is that we're encouraging people to put this tool in their toolbox, right? Continue to use impactful correlational models. It's not a ditch-to-ditch situation here, but explore those areas where if you had clear ideas of the causation, you would be able to make even bigger business impact and with more certainty. So where the investment is large or the consequence is great. So it's another tool to put in the analytics toolbox, but it doesn't mean that you take something out and replace it. It's just additional.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, we're getting close to the end, so I'll let Drew. You were going to give a quick overview. We had asked people when they registered to add any thoughts they had around what some of the big trends are. And Drew, you want to just give the quick overview of this before we sign off?
Absolutely. People were not shy, and we're really appreciative of that. You can see here the breakdown. As Lindsay said, the recording will show the slides so you can examine the breakdown. We want to make it clear that we did some clustering, if you want to say it like that. So some of these AI questions were skepticism. Are we just in an AI hype loop that's not going to add value? But many people do think it's going to have an impact in 2020. The data clustering was all over the place as well, but basically we still as a field need to take more accountability for our data. But what we see when we look at this is that we do see a very good spread across these top 10. Yeah, you have things like AI, but you also have things like ethics and self-serve and business impact. And there is technology in there in the context of cloud and 5G. So there's a lot in 2020 that we'll have to tackle. We've shared with you our priorities. These are what you guys see as priorities. But we do see a lot of overlap between ourselves and what the wisdom of the crowd has said. So, Bill, I'll hand it over to you to sort of take us home.
Yeah. So I know we're hitting the top of the hour, so I'll just say real quick. Here's our summary of our five predictions and priorities for the year. Thanks for everyone for joining. And I know, Lindsay, you're going to want to do a little bit of wrap up here, so I'll kick it to you for the last 2 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And thanks, Tom and Drew and Bob and everyone for joining us today. Great conversations, great questions that came in. Bob, thanks for managing that. And for those who didn't get their questions answered, we're going ahead and recording them, and we can do some follow-up with you. As a reminder, I know I mentioned it, Drew mentioned it, tomorrow a recording of this webinar will be sent out. So make sure you keep an eye out for that email, along with the paper that the gentleman wrote. So all four of them did a whole research paper on the predictions and priorities that has more content and context around what these are and how these are going to impact you in 2020. And final word before we sign off, big news, we opened our registration for the 2020 Spring Analytics Symposium today. So make sure I'll send out that link with everybody tomorrow that you guys get registered. There is a limited amount of folks who are allowed to attend. Community members, this is the only vendor-free analytics conference that there is. So it's all practitioners, it's all thought leaders. There's nobody there trying to sell you anything. This is a place to come and hear some of the top speakers talk about what's happening and what's changing in the analytics world, and to take some actionable insights home with you. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Make sure you stay tuned for that email tomorrow. Keep following us on social. You'll see the 2020 webinars that are coming out here publicized shortly. So thanks again to our speakers. Gentlemen, great job, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.